Hi everyone. Today we are we are the 7th of August 2024. I'm in a very nice place in a China Club with Mr. Andrew Wells. How are you, Andrew?
I'm very well, Mark. Nice to see you here. Yes.
Yes. And today is a very nice afternoon. What are we doing here? It's a nice room with book. It's very quiet. It's a good place for casual meeting. Is it? What do you do? Is it your office, your time, your place to relax? Is it your?
No, Mark. This is a private club, so come here for lunch and dinner. And because I'm talking to you today, I thought we'd get a room which is a little quiet.
Yes.
I'm glad you like the ambience, which is elegant, I think.
Yes, it is. Can you tell us about this gentleman and this room? Because you told me a little bit about this before we started.
Very briefly, the club was started as a concept of the late Sir David Tang, who's quite well known internationally for the Shanghai Tang fashion brand and style brand, now sadly deceased. And he cooperated commercially with my former employers, the Lysun listed group of companies, and between them and one or two other parties, quite a number of years ago now, they opened this China club in Hong Kong. There's another branch in Beijing, but this is the original one. This particular room was the result of a donation by a well-known shipping magnate in Hong Kong to the club, and you can see the nice model ship behind us. But generally this club is unique in Hong Kong and indeed anywhere. It creates a very 1930s but at the same time modern civilisé ambiance, which is quite rare in Hong Kong and indeed not so common elsewhere. Thank you for seeing me here.
Yeah, so thank you for this very nice environment. So we met in RCS event, the Royal Commonwealth Society.
Yes.
And I know you're a patron member of it. You are also a chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, Commonwealth. Is that how you say it?
Secretary General.
Secretary General
of the Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce Hong Kong, to give it its full title.
That's it. So you are involved in so many things, and you are also a former, how do you call it, governor of St. Helena. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so when I met you the first time, I have to say I was impressed because you speak some French. Vous parlez français, n'est-ce pas? Assez bien.
C'est pas très bien, mais ça suffit pour moi en Chine. Hein?
Oui, c'est pas mal du tout. So for an English guy, you speak so many languages, and you speak also Cantonese. Mm-hmm. Perfect Cantonese, as you speak Cantonese to everyone in the restaurant and so on. So there's so many things to say about you. So I don't want to miss the main point. Can you please tell us about you? Introduce yourself. How would you introduce yourself?
Right. Well, thank you for that flattering introduction, Mark. I'll be brief. I come from a quite ordinary background in the UK. My family was in some ways a typical bourgeois family, although I'm sure they wouldn't agree. And I went through the cursus honorum of the day, which is private school and then Cambridge. After Cambridge, I went to the Middle East, and shortly after that, for various reasons, I came to Hong Kong as an administrative officer. That was in the 1970s. I'm happy to tell you lots of stories about that, should you wish. After 1997, I stayed on in the government, and to cut a long story short, I joined the private sector in 2002 or 3, and after that, spent many years in the property sector, mainly in the private sector here. I, as you mentioned earlier, took a couple of years out to go to one of the British overseas territories, specifically St. Helena and its dependencies, where I was initially chief secretary and then acting governor. And then I came back, and in very recent years, I've started to take on more roles in association with the Commonwealth. So very briefly, that's a précis.
Okay, what year was St. Helena?
St. Helena was 2008 to 2011.
Okay, quite recent.
quite recently. Well, I came back, that's still 13 years ago, so it depends how you look at it, I suppose, but I've been back for
So at that time,
over a decade.
As governor of St. Helena, it's a public office?
Yes.
So you were public and then private and then public again?
Yes, within my private sector experience since I left the government, I had private sector experience before I joined, so I suppose I have been a bit of a hybrid. It's been 95% private sector, but there were, as I say, this 2 or 3 years for which I was recruited by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. It was slightly unexpected. I'd expressed an interest in St. Helena many, many years, if not decades before. They remembered somehow, and there was an open recruitment scheme at the time, and so I was invited to go. And when I'd finished that term, I came back to do more or less the same thing here. And then I did have one more public sector experience in 2020 where I was invited back briefly by the Hong Kong government to rejoin them for a certain period of time. Yes.
In which position?
The position was in the Home Affairs Department, so this was in the aftermath of the riots in 2019, and there were a lot of problems locally, and they needed a few people to help out. That's what I did.
Advisor?
No, it was an executive position. It was not a consultancy position. So I have dabbled, as you might put it, back into the public sector. It always interests me to see what it's like on the other side of the engine room, or whatever mixed metaphor you like. But private sector has been the leitmotif for a couple of decades now.
Okay. So you've been in Hong Kong for quite a long time, and you're
I would
still
say
here?
so. Yes.
I understand that you love this place. How do you call it? Do you call it home? Is it here? Is it another place? Why are you not in the UK? Do you miss the UK? So what's your feeling?
Well, when you ask expatriates this question, I'm sure that you'll get quite similar answers if they've been here long enough. They'll tell you generally that the UK is a tired country, it can't compare to the excitement of Hong Kong and so forth. And there is a bit of truth in that, I think. Coming to Hong Kong when I first did in the 1970s, I really wasn't sure what I was getting into, to be honest with you. I'm not one of the people who joined the service with a lot of previous Sino-related experience or family connections. I had worked in the Middle East and in India, but that was as far east from my perspective as I had been. So I was prepared to find it either good or bad. And it offered 2 or 3 very specific advantages which were not available anywhere else at the time. And as a result of those advantages, I stayed on. And once I'd stayed on for long enough, it became a bit addictive. And then, despite the occasional urge to try new places, somehow the old magic persists. Just to tell you what those 3 things were, perhaps.
Yeah, I was about to ask.
So, yeah, it's something which we all think about, we all being slightly antique expatriates like myself, if we've been here long enough. I think the first thing was intellectually totally fascinating. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean because the culture and the language completely alien to anything that I had come across before. And that means, in turn, that even when you're doing rather boring work or performing a very quotidian, mundane task, arguing with a girlfriend or ordering a taxi, discussing what to have for dinner, anything trivial even, you have to go through an intellectual process. The language is one thing, obviously, but beyond the language, the culture behind it. So even rather gloomy days or slightly not too exciting periods acquire a new dimension. I'd found that, of course, in the Middle East, but this was a new one.
I was about to say that. You find it in the Middle East,
yes.
you find it in Tokyo or anywhere else?
You could indeed. I mean, but here you were also given a role so that you could, in fact, you had no choice but to plug in, as it were, to things here. So therefore, the type of experiences you got were not the ones you would get as a tourist or even somebody here on a 3-year contract, which brings me to the second thing, which is I was very lucky that unlike a lot of expatriates here, what I was doing in the administrative service in the government, not typical of government generally, was moving every 2 to 3 years between jobs, between sectors. So at one moment you'd be responsible for local government, next moment it might be involved with security, next moment it might be telecommunications, next moment it might be trade relations or whatever. So you met a completely different set of people, completely different problems. Nowhere, not even the diplomatic service, offers that. So that was the second big factor. And I think thirdly, I mean, the third factor was that unlike joining the government in, say, France, if I may say so, or UK or America, you are not a fonctionnaire, not in those days anyway. You were responsible for not just drafting and suggesting things, but implementing them and selling them to the legislature or the media or the international markets or whatever it was. So you combined, in a way, the roles of politician and civil servant in a way that really doesn't exist in many places. I can't think of anywhere at the moment where it exists. That was very special. If, like me, you had from a young age been slightly obsessed with the idea of doing something where you could actually exercise some power in a meaningful way. So there you go. Intellectual interest, pleasure and power. 3 very, very potent attractants back in those days.
So back in those days, you knew Hong Kong before 97 and after 97. What has changed?
There's no secret about what has changed, Mark. I think most people know, although they may not interpret it in the same way. It's easier to say what's stayed the same, but let me try to answer. What's changed is that Hong Kong has gone through another slight identity shift. It's done that many, many times. If you consider that Hong Kong was first noticed, if I could put it that way, by European powers back in the 1830s, 40s. And clearly what it was then, a remote and not particularly significant part of the British Empire at the time, evolved very quickly. It became crucial in trade and it went through all the different metamorphoses with which I'm sure you and people who may be listening are familiar. Even in more recent times, it's gone through quite a lot. If you look back to the Second World War and then up to the Korean War in the 50s and then the 1960s, there's been phase changes in the economy, in the politics and so forth. So been quite a few of those since I got here. And one of them, of course, was the reunification in 1997. Initially, that didn't make as much difference as you might think in itself. And to the extent that it did, it was a rather positive one because some people had been nervous about the changes because people are always nervous about the unknown. And despite reassurances from everywhere, until you actually do it, some people weren't sure. Actually, what happened in the event was that we got a degree of certainty and stability that had not existed immediately prior to 1997, which was a very difficult period for Hong Kong politically, with 2 rival legislative councils, for example. And there was slightly mischievous interference by various parties in the United Kingdom, which led to some of the uncertainty. But that all settled down after 1997, I'm happy to say. What then changed, though, I think that the biggest single change is the rise of China as a huge economic power. Of course, that had started well before 1997, but it's become more and more obvious. And so Hong Kong's exceptionalness, if there is such a word, exceptionality, difference, it hasn't gone away, but it has changed slightly. So being the only place in China almost where most foreigners could enter, from being a gate, it's become more of a bridge. And that is perhaps a good way of summing it up, the biggest change that I can see. And you can see it in all sorts of small ways. For example, the going into the mainland, as you know, I believe personally, this is not such a small change, in fact, is now a very simple, painless, and indeed daily experience. Before, traffic either way was, in every respect, not something which was easy automatically. So just that one thing is as good as an example as any. And I think also people here now recognize more than they did before, recognize the wrong word, appreciate more than they did before the China part of the equation. So, we have one country, two systems. Well, people do understand a little bit more now about the one country. Previously, you could live in Hong Kong and close your eyes to a lot of the one country. That's not obviously desirable, and now I would say it's not even possible.
So many people like me arrived after '97, and they enjoyed a lot Hong Kong. I would say my version of the good old times was when I arrived in 2012 and the coming years, and it was amazing back then. And nowadays it feels like Hong Kong is a bit still slow to recover from the COVID and other things like what happened politically before. So there is also a before and after 2018-19.
Yes.
I will ask you the same question. What has changed and what's your view about the future? Is Hong Kong still a good place to be, to live and to move to?
Well, that's an excellent question. The previous question was also a good question, but more of historical interest. Well, this is obviously very immediate. So the short answer is yes, it obviously is a good place to come to and to work in. Now, how has it changed particularly, or how has it responded to the things which happened in 2019, 2020 and so forth? So 2 or 3 ways to answer. There's nothing definitive about this. Firstly, of course, it was a rough period. We had quite serious civil disturbances in 2019. We had people rioting, and the causes of this I won't go into now. Was it all foreign agitators and all the rest of it? Well, not altogether, but there was certainly that element there. It was an uncertain time, and just like I said about 1997, people without a longer term vision, some of them may have got nervous. That is now behind us, but there it is. And then we had COVID, nothing like troubles come in 2s and 3s. And COVID was serious here. And some people will tell you, it wasn't that bad here compared to other places. Well, if you're talking about the rules and so forth, that's true. But why it was so serious, why people were afraid, is because we are a very small place, physically and economically. So if you're a big country, US, China, France, UK, wheresoever, whatever you do externally, you have a vast internal economy, you have an internal social setup, you are resilient, even if you make mistakes. And who didn't make mistakes during COVID? Everybody in the world was flying almost blind, I would say. And it's easy to look at anybody's record with hindsight. But for us, if things really went wrong, whatever that means, because we depend entirely on externalities, external trade, external relations, internationalism, all the rest of it, clearly getting it wrong would be much more serious than in a larger entity. That doesn't just apply to COVID, it applies to any problem we have. We reap the benefits of good things in the world perhaps more quickly than others, but also we suffer from, let's say, the bad weather potentially more quickly as well. And so for these reasons, clearly the year of 2019 plus then the 2 nearly years of COVID were pretty depressing and worrying for many people. Now we're out of it. The COVID is not only a thing of the past, but we've learned from it. I mean, if, God forbid, there should be another pandemic, then I think we would know how to deal with it. We've learned from that, and certainly the social situation is very stable. Now, this is all very recent, Mark, these 2 episodes, and in addition to that, of course, we had, as we always have in Hong Kong, geopolitical problems as well, or issues, should I say. It's all very recent, so you can't really expect, realistically, everything to have recovered 100% by now. I think if you look back, as I was saying earlier, to earlier periods in Hong Kong history, you'll see that the inherent resilience, however, is very great. And if you are betting on Hong Kong, you should look actually anywhere really. You should have a little bit of historical perspective. So my view therefore is, and I think this is borne out by reality, whether statistical or anecdotal, is that this is a very positive time. And you know what? When people sell a stock short, it's usually the time to buy. One of the new things, which is big plus, I mentioned already the upsurge in mainland China's economy and so forth, where it becomes visible almost in a matter of weeks that the development is so fast. Now we are fully integrated almost with what, as you know, is called the Greater Bay Area. So that's the cities close to, within a couple of hours' drive of Hong Kong. Total of 11 cities, population of 70 million people. The standard of living in many of which is higher than it is here. So that's a huge positive for young people, for very young students, for entrepreneurs, for startup companies, for retirees, just about for every interest group, I would say. That two-way traffic, that's one of the positives now. So it's not just, I don't want to give the impression that it's, hey, we had some hard times, but good old Hong Kong spirit, we've come through them, because people could be cynical about that. It's true though. But in addition to that, there are some new positives which are filtering through, and despite distortions in the media sometimes, are very real to anybody who's here, and I'm sure you will have experienced them too.
Do you think the Greater Bay Area can become bigger than Shanghai and the rest of China? I feel like I love now be going to Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Guangzhou. I was there last week. Is there what's your guess on what's going to happen in the next few years?
Yeah, I don't think it's a zero-sum competition at all. So, as you know, there are three huge economic drivers in the mainland, which are talked about all the time. One is in the north in Beijing, one is in Shanghai and adjacent provinces in Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and one is in Guangdong province, which are the 11 cities of the GBA, including Guangzhou as the capital, but then many other cities, which amazingly people haven't heard of, even they've got populations of 10 million or more. Quite extraordinary. Cities bigger than London.
That's China.
That is indeed. But they're very concentrated there. So I think the focus of these groupings, if I can put it that way, is not the same. And the amount of growth potential is so vast that there's something in it for everyone, and not just those three well-known groupings. Recently, there's been a lot of attention paid to Hainan Island, for example, as a new growth area. There's also been a very distinct and successful effort by the government to focus people's attention a bit more on the western part of China, especially Sichuan, and that, if you look at Chongqing or Chengdu, is clearly bearing fruit. Just looking, even without looking at the international side, just the internal consumption in China is nowhere near its potential peak yet. So there's vast growth opportunities. And of course, as the world settles down again, and even when it doesn't, either way, there are opportunities for the creative and the adventurous. So I think the GBA will grow, yes. I think it will become better known internationally. I think it will become more mature. It will attract more, it's already doing a lot, it will attract more expatriates such as myself to live and to work. But it won't be exclusively the GBA by any means. But it's significant for Hong Kong because we have the physical infrastructure. You can get in a car and be at your home in wherever, in Guangdong province in an hour or two, and get on the fast train, same thing.
So, recently I see some comments. I have different groups in the social media, Facebook and so on. And a few years ago, I used to have a lot of people posting some messages saying, oh, I got a job in Hong Kong, I'm coming next month, I'm coming in 3 months, very exciting, please help me, like, where should I live, where's the good place to find a flat share and so on, where's the good places to eat and so on and so on. Nowadays I see more and more questions about, hey, I have a job offer in Hong Kong, I have a good job offer in New York, I don't know which one to choose. How is life in Hong Kong? Tell me the truth. They see some things on TV and this and that. So I feel like the image of Hong Kong and more globally China is not very good compared to a few years ago. What do you think about it? And people who are hesitating to come or not, even though they have a job offer, what do you tell them? Should I jump in the plane and come, don't hesitate? Or what's really life?
I think there's an old expression which says in English, he who hesitates is lost. So if you don't jump in the plane, there are plenty of other people who will. That's not to say you should take every job offer in Hong Kong or anywhere else. Obviously, you're going to look at your own individual interests and circumstances, but there shouldn't be anything that would put you off in any way compared to the past, for example. As to the media and the image, I think we've got a problem. I think France has got a serious problem. I think South Africa, Russia, I think the United States has a serious problem. I think even Japan has got a problem. I think Singapore's got a problem. Everybody's got a problem now because the attention span of the media is so tiny because of internet, because of social media, that only the very, very dramatically focused so-called bad news becomes circulated very often. Good news has to be really unbelievably good to get a look in, and something that would not have even been noticed by anyone before is now not only noticed, commented on by people who actually may not know a great deal or anything about it. Everybody becomes an expert, and it's always the bad news that is headlined. Going back to COVID is a perfect example. One of the problems with it for everyone, everywhere in the world, was that you could be in, let us say, Hong Kong, and you could be just an ordinary guy in Hong Kong, and you'd be worried because of the statistics from Iceland. Or you could be in Brussels and you'd be worried about what was happening in Santiago in Chile. That was not the case before. Now, having said that, that's not to say we can't do more. I think the government, the Beijing, the central government and the Hong Kong government are doing a lot. I think the business community is doing a lot, but perhaps could do a bit more. There's always a temptation for the business community just to look to itself. But given the interests at stake, I think it can do more. Chambers of commerce, interested parties of all kinds. And one thing we can all do, Mark, is that when you listen to a comment from some friend or contact, business partner, which you know to be ill-informed, you can explain to them politely why and how it is ill-informed. Other than that, not a great deal you can do, but that's quite a lot already. I mean, if everybody does that, I think that's a step in the right direction. As I say, chambers of commerce and other groups can be a little bit more proactive in presenting a positive front, not a false front, because people can easily check on things these days. But the facts speak for themselves once you know them. So I'm quite prepared to take questions, not just from you, but from anybody. Well, what about this? Isn't that a concern? And I can tell you why it isn't a concern, basically. Not to say there are no concerns at all, but then there would be wherever you move to, right?
And if people want to start a business in Hong Kong, they can contact the Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce, right?
Well, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the Commonwealth is important to me because we're no longer just talking about the British Commonwealth, but one of the things the British can take some credit for, albeit unintentionally perhaps, was the spread of the Anglosphere. Somehow their language has become the only real international language, with all respect to the Chinese and French and so forth, and a legal system to go with it. Now you have this vast Commonwealth community, no longer centred in the UK, of 50-something countries and another 20-odd administrations. And then you have the Chinese, Greater China as we call it, so mainland and the Chinese communities around the world and China's friends throughout the Central Asia and the Belt and Road and so forth. And you have Hong Kong as a bridge, as I said earlier, which is unique. So this is culturally and intellectually fascinating, endlessly fascinating, but in business terms, it's marvelous because everything comes together here. This is something that Singapore, for example, can never aspire to.
So many of our friends or just random people hesitate between Hong Kong and Singapore, even China and Singapore, because they are worried about the freedom. So if there's only one question I would say I'd like to ask you about life in Hong Kong or in China in general, because you know China pretty well, you go to mainland China quite often. Is there freedom in China? Do you feel free?
In what sense do you mean free? In the way that you can say what you like and do what you like within the constraints of the
I
law?
would guess so. Like what most people by just ask me on social media, like I would turn the question another way. Like quite often I share about my life in Hong Kong and China, but I'm going to a restaurant, I'm going here and there, and I say, oh, life is good here. And
Yes.
people reply to me and say, yeah, but you prefer to live in a dictatorship than to live in France, where life is, you have freedom in France. So what do you reply to this? Because France, UK is about the same. Are you more free in UK or in France than in China?
I think it means free to do what? I think in China, as I see it, or in Hong Kong, if you will, you are free to live your life and run your business as you wish within the law, and you're free to do those things in theory in Western Europe as well, except that you're not really always, because you are often prevented by either political instability. Look at the countries you just mentioned recently. There's something which we do have here, but it's rare, and it is taken not as a sort of benefit somehow, which I sometimes feel that when there's a serious riot in UK or France, people almost say, well, this isn't bad because this is to do with freedom. No, it really isn't, And you're not free here to damage people's property or to kill people and things of that kind. I mean, if people do that, they will be dealt with. And this does not. I mean, words like dictatorship, autocracy, these are not appropriate because this is not the case. You have a government which is in China, which is extremely in tune with the popular will, and that's not me saying it, and it's not the Communist Party saying it. This is easily borne out by any opinion survey that even Western media do.
I would say people in France are under dictatorship now.
No comment. I mean, there's obviously always in every society there's a trade-off, right? But here, I think that there are two problems that I'll admit to. Now, the one is that there's a tendency everywhere, and it happens in China as well, I admit, when you have a problem to blame outsiders. And you see that how many people have got big prejudices one time or another about, say, the Japanese, about the Indians, about the Americans, about the Brits, about the French for sure, and of course about the Chinese, of course. So it's easier to sort of say, but it's all because of those bad guys over there, rather than actually think sensibly about it. Not much you can do about that, really. But the other thing, though, is more specific to Hong Kong, perhaps more interesting, which is that Hong Kong does perhaps fall down in one way, compared to China at least, which is that Hong Kong has had it very good for so long. It's been such a comfortable place to live, both nothing to do with the reunification in '97, both before and after. Such a comfortable place to live and do business, that a certain complacency can arise, especially in business, whether it's small business or big business. I think for many years, if you were an executive in a big organization, you have a good year, so you think about opening an office in another province of China. If you're a small business, well, you probably think the same way. Now that the world economy is not to be taken for granted in quite the same way as before, and now that Hong Kong has to accept that it is not just one city, it's only that works in this way in China. There is competition. So we have to look for new opportunities and new markets and not be complacent. There's a danger of being too inward-looking. A funny thing to say about an international city, I know. I see every sign that we're getting past that, though. The Commonwealth coming in again there.
Okay, nice. So you mentioned the situation in the UK. Can you tell us your feelings, your thoughts? What's happening now in the UK with the protest? And some people call it like far-right protest. What do you think about it?
I don't want to give an expert opinion on the UK because I'm only partly English and I haven't lived there since, goodness gracious me, 50 years, I think. So I'm no expert, but obviously I do have friends and contacts there. From what I can see, UK faces a situation which is not terribly dissimilar from other, quote, Western, unquote, countries. There's been so much indulgence, if I can put it that way, of political extremism on both sides. People almost take it as a right, and I feel that there's no real benefit accruing to that country from having a complete change of course every few years. I don't think that this kind of bottled democracy, as it were, creates prosperity. I think it's the other way around. I think the huge prosperity that Western countries had in the earlier part of the 20th century in particular, and post-war, gave them the spare fat, as it were. They gave them the luxury of experimenting in this way, whether it was social.
When there were like kingdoms and
no.
politically they were stable. That's what you mean?
No. I mean what I mean is that when you start with a very, very strong power, let's say as the UK was, certainly up to the earlier part of the 20th century, yes, the last century, you have an enormous built-in surplus, as it were, of things that you can get wrong simply because you have the resources to get them wrong. I mean, Britain survived the Second World War, it survived the loss of empire, it still had this prosperity that was inherent in hundreds of years of being successful. And you can squander that very, very easily because you have the resources to do so. But you can't keep squandering it forever. You can't just keep printing silly money and promising everybody everything and trying to do the trick of saving the only place in the world I know which has historically managed to have a track record of spending more on public services, cutting tax and acquiring more reserves most years has been Hong Kong. So it's a bit pointless for a Western or any other country to live that way. And when you try, then what's going to happen is your political parties will just engage in a bidding war. People will get very disillusioned with that. They will either look to a hypothetical future, an idealistic future, which may or may not be realistic, or they may look to a very nostalgic version of the past, or both. But concrete solutions to real problems that everybody can accept might not be the top priority for anybody in the government, because the system isn't geared in that pragmatic way. Whereas here, I think it is. People are really concerned with what works properly, rather than what might pander to the vanity of particular influencers or politicians. I think there's a big difference.
So tell us about because you didn't live for how long did you live in the UK?
I left. Well, my first job outside of the UK was probably when I was 16, and I left, as it were, for good and all when I was 21. So that's quite a long time ago.
Okay. Well, were you still proud to be British, and you represented the government, the country as a governor? Can you tell us about this experience in St. Helena and so on?
Well, of course, I think you should be. I think to be proud to be British, or in my case, part British, is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. If you're not proud of your own country, there's a problem. And again, this is a problem with. You were talking about the West and what my perception might be of it, and I think that this is not historically true. But if
loss of identity,
loss of pride in the identity, at least even if you have the identity, you feel obliged in some cases to apologise for it. I don't think that there are many people let's take our. I think this is more true in England than in France, in fact, because I think in France, on the whole,
in France, in some places, if you have a French flag, you're seen as racist.
Well,
you shouldn't have the flag of your own country.
That if that's so, that is very unfortunate, and I think that tendency is there to a greater or lesser extent in the UK as well. But be that as it may, I think that in a healthy situation, obviously that won't be the case. How can you have a strong economy? How can you have social cohesion? How can you have a proper educational system if you're not proud of your own achievements in the past? Not to say that you don't appreciate the achievements fully of other countries. We're an international city in Hong Kong, so of course we do, and we welcome people from everywhere. But no doubt about it, extremely proud of the Chinese heritage. But I mean, coming to your question about the UK, yes, so when I was in St. Helena, I was recruited as the chief secretary, as the head of administration of a small island. It was absolutely fascinating, and the people there, as in most of the surviving overseas territories, which there are 16 or 17, depending how you count, are proud of being British. They don't buy into a lot of the political correctness which infests the media, the Western media in particular, and the soi-disant intelligentsia in many Western countries. They don't. You think of the Falklands in that context. It's a very good example. They're very proud of being British. Gibraltar, right? Very proud of being British. And the same was true in Saint Helene, although of course there was a strong French element as well because of the Emperor's imprisonment. But yes, it was a fascinating job.
So what is, a lot of people don't know much about Saint Helene, the part that Napoleon stayed there for the last few years of his life. Can you tell us about what is it exactly? It's a small island, bigger island. How many people live there? What does it represent to you?
Okay, so again, there were two things which attracted me there. Historically, I've been interested for family reasons in Napoleon and the Emperor's history and achievements, and because of that, and because he did spend the latter part of his life there, and of course, as you know, he died very, very young, in his 50s. That was in a way just as important a period for him as the period when he was militarily successful, because it enabled him to lay the foundations for the way he's now being regarded. And therefore, when I was back in my 20s in Hong Kong working, I did express an interest in Saint Helena. You were encouraged in those days, if you were interested in an overseas territory position, to express an interest, and usually that would then be filed away, I guess. So it was many, many years later that this somehow came into somebody's pending tray. I really didn't expect this to come up, and when it did, that was one reason. But the other reason was, I mentioned earlier that an attraction of Hong Kong job that I had was you could get things done. So here you were, small island, a few thousand people left, I can come back to that, but no real modern communications. So no mobile phone, no airport.
No, really?
No, none. So the only communication by ship. So if anything happened on the island, any disease, any accident, any natural misfortune, any security breakdown, anything really, well, you had nothing to cope with it except yourself. So just the sort of thing I enjoyed doing, and I had a great time. And in addition to that, the British had decided that they'd give it an airport, give the place an airport. So we had the negotiations for a new airport, the world's most expensive airport by far by passenger throughput.
By passenger?
Yeah, but hundreds of millions of dollars, even in absolute terms.
How old is the airport?
It was opened just a few years ago. I had left before the opening. It took a long time to build because it had to be built to all the relevant standards, not just British, EU and the rest of it. And it had to be accepted by international aviation experts and all the rest of it. There was a huge mobilization problems to get, because it's a volcanic island, so there's nowhere to land things. Everything has to be brought in, so the cost escalated. The geology is extremely difficult. The wind.
Active volcans?
No, these are extinct volcanoes, fortunately. So that was all part of the fun, and I've been back a few times since.
Could I go to visit St. Helena? What's there to do there? Hiking?
Yes. Yeah, it's spectacularly beautiful. It's visited a lot by people who are interested in, for example, the international yacht fraternity. People who live on their boats. It's one of the big centers. People go back and forth from Brazil, for example. So people interested in that. People interested in astronomy, because it's a great place. I mean, astronomy. So Halley, as in Halley's Comet, went there.
Clear sky.
Yes, fantastic. Then people who are interested in evolution. So it has some unique species, many actually, both plant and an animal, and the world's oldest living land animal, which is a giant tortoise, which is about 200 years old. people go there also if they're interested in 18th century British colonial things, because it has the plantation houses preserved. People are interested in the abolition of the... No, people live in them. And then people who are interested in the abolition of the slave trade go a lot, because it was a major center for the abolition of the slave trade. They're the largest slave graves in the world. People are interested in the emperor, because of course there are 3 small domains there which are owned by France rather than by UK, so there's a great deal of historical interest there. And in short, there's a lot of military as well, Antarctic exploration, yes. I'd say that at any one time there are dozens of consultants living there. Lots and lots to do. And I've been fortunate to be asked to bring a few groups of quite well-known figures to visit the island in the last year or two. And there's no short of interest. I'm surprised by the extent of the interest, but you need to go and check it out.
Interesting. Oh, why were you interested in the emperor?
Oh, well, I'm a sort of historian manqué. I come from a generation just about where it was normal, not just expected or not just allowed, but it was normal to be a classicist, to study classics. So after the age of 14, the only subjects I studied were Latin and Greek. That's all. Nothing else. And that
Latin and Greek?
Yes, I was a classicist.
You speak Latin?
I'm probably the spoken Latin is a little rusty. I can certainly read it. I was just as fluent as I was in English. Yes, well, that was normal back in the day, as they say. And that develops an interest in history, and it's not a huge step from being interested in Roman history and Greek history to being interested in, for example, Middle Eastern history, French history, Chinese history, or whatsoever. I'm quite influenced by some of the early English and French historians in that respect, personally, intellectually influenced. And then, in addition to that, my maternal grandfather was French, and we have family connections with one of the families of one of the marshals, one of Napoleon's marshals.
Some French, or just
no, I learned what French I have a little bit. Of course, we learned very badly at public school, and then most of the rest would have been at Cambridge, where it's an international university. So you have to be able to get by in a few modern languages, if only to converse with the other people in your field.
What's your opinion on Napoleon?
Oh,
Was he a good man? Do we need a new Napoleon in France, in Europe?
We arguably need fewer people who think they are. Napoleon was, I think, was one of the most extraordinary men who ever lived. No doubt about it. His achievements quite extraordinary for a single individual in a very difficult time, and with the lack of communication and resources which he faced. And people often say that he was a man of his time and this sort of cliche. I don't really buy that. He was extraordinary for any epoch. And frankly, in a different period of history, he might have been more successful, but he had to do too much too quickly in a way. But his legacy, which extends far beyond the sphere of the military, is colossal and is still with us. And if I think, if Mont Saint-Jean or Waterloo had gone the other way, which it very nearly did, we might be looking at a very different kind of European Union now.
Well, it's been a long time already. I didn't see time flying. It's very interesting.
Well, thank you, Mark.
How much time do we still have?
No, we're fine as much as you wish.
Well, can I ask you about the British monarchy? What do you think about it?
I try not to. You asked me earlier whether I was proud of being British, and I think my answer was, and should have been, I try to be. Sometimes my countrymen don't make it very easy for me, I feel, these days. Maybe you feel a bit that way about France as well. Sometimes we can be our own worst enemies. I don't think the monarchy is any exception to that. We've had ever since the House of Hanover took over, we have not exactly, the monarchy hasn't exactly distinguished itself for intellectual brilliance, but maybe it's not supposed to. But more recently, it's arguable that it hasn't really distinguished itself at all very much. Then, of course, you get into the argument, if you wish to be drawn into it, of yes, but that's all very well, but what's the alternative? Maybe it's the best that we have for the time being, but I'm not going to get terribly enthusiastic about it, that's for sure.
What do you think about the new government?
In which country? They've got them all over.
Your Labour government.
Oh, they're not my Labour government. My government is in Beijing. The government in UK, we've had so many recently. I think it illustrates the point that I was making earlier. I mean, you kind of get the government you deserve in a way, and this was foreseeable. I think you didn't have to be a great prophet to be able to foresee this was going to happen. People seem to be saying that, well, at least it won't be so colourful now and there'll be some common sense. I don't buy that at all. I think having a socialist government in power of an important economy is not a good thing at all. I mean, it hasn't yet revealed itself in what I suspect are its true colours, but it's gradually doing so. The good side of it, I guess, is that it does give the Conservative Party, the Tory Party, a needed chance to revive its thinking and become a little bit more relevant and less complacent. Obviously it has become complacent. And so if you're an optimist, as I try to be, then maybe that's the silvery lining. At the moment, I find the UK, quite frankly, rather depressing in comparison, let's say, with your country. There was a very good article in The Spectator this week, why is England so ugly? And I think this is a problem that France doesn't have. But politically, I'm no expert, but I think that any country which has got itself into a situation where not a plurality, but more people voted for that party than bothered to vote for anybody else is in a certain amount of trouble.
I think we have similar problems in the UK and France. I see many people in France asking me about advices how to move to Hong Kong or other places. Do you have the same experience with British people?
Yes.
Do all of them want to leave the UK? Or what's the mindset? Do they want to stay and fight? Do they want civil war or whatever? Or do they just want to live and find a better place to start a family, a business, and have a good life?
You know, Mark, I think that one of the things that worries me about UK is that quite a lot of people seem to be resigned to it. Now, when I left UK to Middle East and then to Hong Kong, one of the things, come to think of it, which I didn't mention, but which was an obvious motive for anybody in my demographic, as they say now, was the fact that things were going so badly there. These were the years of the 3-day week and the miners' strikes and the Heath and Wilson governments and all the rest of it. And I saw the top marginal tax rate at 90-something%, and I thought, this is ridiculous, this is preposterous, there's no way that I want to live in a country which rewards its successful members in that way, never mind its unsuccessful members. So I then left, and then of course Britain had the period of Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair and all the rest of it. So on the face of it, there was some change. Was it all for the good? I don't know, but it seems that these old habits die hard.
Who was the best Prime Minister of the UK?
Ever? Yeah. It depends who you are. It really does. I mean, you could say Pitt the Younger, but then if you were Napoleon, you probably wouldn't think that. I'm pretty much a fan of Disraeli, I think.
Oh.
Disraeli, Benjamin Disraeli.
I was thinking you would say like Churchill or Thatcher.
Well, Churchill was another fantastically multi-talented individual, wasn't he? So he was a Nobel Prize winner, he was a great artist, he was a brilliant writer, he was a very good soldier, and he was a great war leader. He actually didn't spend much time as Prime Minister in charge of his own party, but nobody is going to take away from his achievement, that's for sure. The thing with Margaret Thatcher, well, it's the sustainability of it. a lot of things which he did, I was applauding and cheering about, not just from a British point of view. They just seemed to be good things for a country to do. But why is that not still sustained in the UK polity, as far as I can see? Big questions then arise, rather than just picking one to be good or bad. Actually, some of the most charming British politicians that I've known personally have not been the most effective leaders, that's for sure. Ted Heath springs to mind in that context.
A question comes to my mind related to Hong Kong. During the protest, a lot of people from Hong Kong took the opportunity of the British national overseas passport that they know, I think, they moved to the UK, looking for a better life. It looks like now, many of them looks like life is maybe not what they expected, maybe finding a job is not that easy. What's your feeling about it? Did they make the right choice? Should they stay there? Should they come back? Or whatever, or you don't think anything about it, you don't agree. What do you feel?
I think you're right. I think that a lot of people probably regret that move. And again, I think that the modern short-termist attitude, which applies everywhere, not just in Hong Kong, is largely to blame. You think, maybe in 2 years' time I'm going to be very successful compared to where I am. I've got more opportunities and my business will be safer or something. I don't know many of these people personally. I do know some. So if that was the calculation, it wasn't a very good one, because I think anybody who'd had experience of living and working in UK could have told them, yes, there are certain good things, but here are the disadvantages, and you may find that it's a little bit difficult in this respect. And as I've said before, I mean, a place like Hong Kong is like a little bit, not many places can compare with it. Maybe Venice in the days of La Serenissima, when Venice was so important in the world, can make a comparison. You need a fairly strong sense of determination to ride out the ups and downs, because, as I keep saying, it's a small place. So you're up and down on the waves. If you're mainland China or US or Russia or UK, France, you're big and you've got an inbuilt inertia, for want of a better word. So, but Hong Kong will experience this. So you've got to be one of the people who are prepared to ride it out. I also think that the British government was very cynical about offering the scheme that it did. And it's done it. It's got form on this. We talked about Saint Helena earlier. So it's got very few people now. One of the reasons why most of the territories, except for the financial centres in the Caribbean, like BVI, have got so few people is because people have left. And they've left because they've got British passports and there's not much for them to do on these small islands. And they've got the passports because after 1997, when Britain was desperate for people not to come from Hong Kong to Britain, there was great debates about it, but it was very, very clear they were not welcome. But once that was passed, they then gave passports to the citizens of all the other territories, which did those territories actually no good, but it was very cynical. And I mean, the FCO has privately admitted this. It's the same thing here. This was a political maneuver. It wasn't out of some altruistic, sudden love for the people of Hong Kong on the part of London, not at all. So while I believe that people are responsible for their own decisions, I suspect that quite a lot of them feel that they were taken for a bit of a ride. Can only hope that in the future people learn that lesson.
Okay. I would say last question, nothing to do with China or the UK. What about the US? What's happening now? What do you think? Are you for Trump or for Harris? Or for no one? What do you think? What's your feeling?
Well, what did Oscar Wilde say about America? He said, "I can love the whole world except an American." I think it's really quite hard to compare their polity to anywhere else. It was born out of, in almost a vacuum, exiles and rebels from all over the world. The idea that there was an American identity had to be artificially created. When that part of my family who went there, you were not so much an American as you were Polish American, an Irish American, a Jewish American, a Hispanic American, or whatever. And of course, that's still true to a degree. So it's very, very fragmented. And under those circumstances, again, the question of sustainability comes up. I don't want to be pessimistic, not in my rule book, as has probably become clear, but the sustainability of this two-party system that they have here, with no crossing over that line, it seems to me gives the people worst of all possible worlds. And it's quite hard for folk in Hong Kong, by the way, Chinese or expatriate, to understand it, because we're not used to, on top of all the other uncertainties of life, family and economy and patriotism and war and pandemics and whatnot, to have on top of all of that a sort of eternal TV drama series, yes, on which billions upon billions of dollars are spent for almost every participant. In that regard, it's worse than almost any system, so you can't really expect that much to come out of it. I think it's very unfortunate that the choice, from American perspective, that the choice is what it is. I think from a Chinese perspective, I can't speak on behalf, wouldn't speak on behalf of the Chinese government, obviously, but again, the historical perspective comes in. I think that we'll be happy-ish to live with whatever the outcome is. Once the outcome is sorted out, then people perhaps will feel less obliged to make ridiculous promises. The degree of xenophobia that exists in the States and the Anglo world generally is lamentable. Well. Yes, in Europe as well, of course. But again, as I say, that's very much scapegoating in my view. You've got big problems, as we just outlined, so it's easier to blame other people for it. And we all know that Americans do that a lot.
I feel like you feel more Chinese than British. Sometimes.
Well, the expression in Chinese would be 小人不敢, which means humble me wouldn't presume. But clearly, having been treated very well here for very many years, I don't in any way think that I'm Chinese, either because I look up to or look down on it, and it's not my identity. But I'm very happy to be here, and I have a Chinese family, and I live in the mainland as well as here, and I wouldn't want it any other way, to be honest. It's the more you know about it, the more attractive the proposition really becomes. But I still very much enjoy my trips to Western Europe and to France and Italy, to Europe more than to UK, I have to say.
It makes me think of Alan Zeman. He became Chinese.
Yes.
He used to be British, right?
Yes. American. I'm not sure. American or Canadian, I can't remember. Anyway. But yeah,
his passport and he became Chinese.
Yes, well, people do that sometimes, but it doesn't. If people think that sort of makes them more socially acceptable, that's not why Alan did it. Of course, one time it was the easiest way to have a smooth border crossing. Now, expatriate can get a 5-year permit without a visa and so forth. So it's extremely user friendly for foreigners. That's developed over the years. I don't actually think that anybody. There are people who sort of like to be more Chinese than Chinese. You find that in France or England as well. You want to be more English or French than the English or French. That probably doesn't really work for in a country where people have such long traditions. But no, Alan's a great example. He's a great guy. He's a good example of how people can ride out the ups and downs and be very successful here in all sorts of circumstances.
Well, it was very interesting for me. It was 1 hour already. Any further word, anything to say, to add, special to add?
Not really, Mark. Thank you very much. I think that it's great that you are doing this kind of work, what you are doing in the social, economic, political world, and I think that selling the message of Hong Kong as a good place to come is important, not just for Hong Kong economy and not just for propaganda or even for that particularly. I think it's part of the kind of internationalism that we can all welcome. We can all be, as you were saying earlier, proud of our national identities and loving where we were born and respectful of our ways of government, but at the same time open to welcoming other experiences and cultures, and Hong Kong is the best place to do that. So promoting that message is good for everyone, people in Europe, France, UK, and also our friends in Hong Kong and China as well.
sometimes I say that Hong Kong is the center of the world because the world shifts to Asia, and Hong Kong is a kind of center of Asia, international place. Do you agree with me?
Yes, I do.
Somehow?
Yes, you put it better than I. That's absolutely right.
Thank you very much. It was
Not it,
very
I.
interesting.
Not it, not
It's a
it.
pleasure.